Hi everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Paul 313, Political Theory and its Applications. This week we're going to be looking at Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws. This was a work that was extremely influential on the Founding Fathers in the United States, and I think looking at this work along with Madison next week, we will see a sort of full development of the idea of separation of powers in Montesquieu, and then this sort of specific application in this country in the system of checks and balances that was developed by Federalists like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Montesquieu is strongly influenced by Aristotle, and Aristotle's idea of virtue being found at the mean between two excesses, so that if we go to the excess, we are engaging in vice, but if we aim towards the mean, then we will ensure that we are following the path of virtue. So for Montesquieu, the idea of moderate government, the government that aims towards the mean, is key to ensuring that government institutions function well, that they govern in accordance with law, and that the government or that the society avoids a collapse into despotism. Despotism is where the rulers exercise arbitrary power, where they govern according to their own whims and in their own selfish interests. And for Montesquieu, this is the worst form of government and one that must be avoided. This can be avoided through good laws and good citizens. So I would argue that Montesquieu falls between the classical liberal and the classical republican tradition. On the Republican side, Montesquieu advocates the idea of virtue, particularly within a democracy. In democracies, the virtue of the citizens is critical. Citizens must be able to engage in responsible participation. They must limit the kinds of demands that they make on government. And if they are able to do this, and if virtue is able to be maintained, then good democratic institutions can also be maintained. The moderation of the democratic system can be ensured. If the people go to excess, then the democracy descends into despotism and essentially becomes a tyranny of the majority, where the rights of others are trampled, where majorities use the power of government to fulfill their own selfish interests, and where essentially the idea of a public good is non-existent. Now, in order to maintain virtue, good law is necessary, education of the citizens is critical, and all of this is geared towards ensuring that the virtue of the citizenry is maintained. So here I think we see some overlap or some similarities between the Republican ideas of Rousseau and Montesquieu. Now, Montesquieu will differ from the Republicans, however, in arguing that relying on virtue alone is not sufficient. And here is where I think his influence on the liberal tradition comes into play. On the liberal side, what Montesquieu will advocate are limitations on the power of government, that there needs to be institutional checks on power, and popular power in particular, in order to ensure that if a citizenry is not virtuous, then the fallback can be relying on institutions to maintain the moderation of government. So in this sense, and in order to place these institutional limits on the power of government, Montesquieu proposes the system of the separation of powers, where the legislative, executive, and judicial powers are all embodied in different institutions. Now, Montesquieu's hesitancy to rely solely on the virtue of the citizens comes from his view of power. Basically, Montesquieu will argue that power inevitably corrupts, that holding power creates too great a temptation to use that power to fulfill one's own selfish interests. And so this corrupting nature of power itself is what necessitates creating the institutional limits on power within government. And basically what the system of the separation of powers does is ensures that power checks power, that each institution is given its own specific tasks that the other branches of government are not allowed to abrogate. So, for instance, the legislative branch has the exclusive power to levy taxes. The executive branch is able to veto acts by the legislature. All of this, we could see, I think, had a great influence on the American Founding Fathers, and in many ways, the Founding Fathers drew directly from the work of Montesquieu, in addition to drawing directly from the work of John Locke. So I think if we compare Locke and Montesquieu, Locke is going to provide the sort of theoretical basis for the idea of individual liberty and natural rights, while Montesquieu will delve into the specifics of how to structure a government in order to ensure that power does not corrupt the government as a whole or corrupt the people. So this combination of the virtue of the citizenry and institutional restraints serves as the sort of best possible way of ensuring the moderation of a democratic form of government. Now, interestingly, Montesquieu is one of the few theorists of separation of powers that delves deeply into the judicial power. The Federalists, for instance, are generally vague on the role of the judiciary. In the Constitution itself, if you look at Article 3, it is the most vague of the articles compared to Article 1 and 2, for instance, where the powers of Congress and the presidency are explicitly set forward. Article 3 basically establishes a Supreme Court, but does not grant the power of judicial review to that court. Judicial review will emerge as a result of a ruling in the Marbury versus Madison decision. So the Federalists are quite vague about the power of the judiciary. Montesquieu, on the other hand, is very specific, and he delves into the specifics because he believes that the judicial power can be the greatest danger to the individual citizen. And his logic is this: if we look at the acts of the legislative or executive branch, these are general in their scope. The law that that the Congress creates and that the executive authorizes deal with society as a whole, deal with the population as a whole, and sets broad limits on individual behavior. The judiciary, on the other hand, is where individual citizens will most likely directly face the power of government. So a corrupt judiciary, for instance, can exert a very real toll on the average citizen. If a corrupt judge makes a ruling that seizes the property of an individual, this is a direct impact on that specific individual. And so for Montesquieu, the judicial power plays a key role in, or limits on the judicial power play a key role in preventing the exercise of arbitrary power by the state in a venue where it is most likely to happen. So the kinds of limits that Montesquieu envisions on the judiciary really sort of rely on the sort of impermanence of the judicial branch as an institution. So having judges serve terms of office, using jury trials, all of this basically guarantees that there's no single individual in a court system that will necessarily exercise power at all times. So this, for Montesquieu, is a good way of placing limits on the judicial power, and also goes a long way towards defining the role that the judiciary plays in the broader system of checks and balances. We will see how Montesquieu's work influences the founders, more specifically when we look at Madison and the Federalists. But for this week, focus on Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, his emphasis on the system of checks and balances, and his idea of power as a corrupting force on the virtue of citizens and on the virtue of leaders as well. Have a good weekend, everyone, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you very much. Have a good week.